So yeah, Chris Cutrone is here. We are recording what I think it's going to be a Pop the Left episode
Okay.
about the avant-garde. Uh, I discussed this with you, I guess, a week or so ago, and you advised me to reread Clement Greenberg's essay "Avant-Garde and Kish."
Yes.
Is that quiche? Kish? No, it's not
Kit.
quiche. Kish. And I did, and which I'd read it before,
Uh-huh.
and before we really start talking about the essay, which is something I thought we'd do,
Uh-huh.
I want to tell you what I thought about Greenberg before. Like when I first encountered him, when I first read him, which was not that long ago, it was I don't know, maybe a decade ago. Because
Maybe
I didn't,
before you really took Marxism very seriously, though.
perhaps, yeah. I mean, I was beginning to take Marxism seriously, but I thought of Greenberg as a Cold War liberal.
He's not.
Uh, yeah, right. But that's how he was sort of presented to me.
By the
Uh,
fake left
yeah,
that
yeah,
loves to slander people.
yeah. And so, but he was a Cold War liberal, champion of abstract expressionism, which was an art movement that was funded by the CIA and part of the propaganda war that helped define the second half of the 20th century. This is the story that I was
That's
sort of
old.
sold. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Um,
was told the same story. That's a familiar story. It's not that it's unknown to me.
Right. So, but rereading it now, especially getting all the way to the end and realizing
Yes.
he closes with a quote from Marx,
Yep.
I have a different opinion of him in any case, and also perhaps I should re-examine my opinions about. I hate to do this about Pollock and
Yes.
abstract expressionism, and
Yes.
like I'm.
Yes.
Uh, so, and in any case, so we're going to be approaching Greenberg as uh, somehow a fellow traveler with Trotskyism, maybe
Yep. Marxist.
um, a Marxist of some kind, and um, so that's where we'll begin.
Now,
But
I
I
will
also
say,
go ahead.
he did back off from Marxism in the Cold War era. And, you know, so his best writings are from the 30s and the 40s,
Mhm.
although his later writings are also quite worthwhile. We might think of it in terms of anti Stalinism, right?
Mhm.
So, parallel to others like Shachtman or even like a Dwight MacDonald, right, who
Mhm.
was the Partisan Review guy. And the Frankfurt School, of course, is
Mhm.
also tarred with this brush of Cold War liberalism and anti Sovietism or anti communism, but really anti Stalinism. So it's tricky, and he does retreat into a kind of enlightenment mongering. It's a familiar kind of track of former leftists, but I think that intellectually Marxism remained formative for him throughout, right? So he might have retreated politically, but intellectually he still had the same basic standpoint. And I would say that also, you released the video recently dealing with Guy Debord and situationism. And I did want to talk to you about that because I wanted to talk about the periodization, the historical periodization involved in Debord's argument,
Mhm.
and really make a case for distinguishing between the bourgeois era and the capitalist era, but
Okay.
also get into modernism the way you addressed it there via Debord, and you also raised Walter Benjamin, and we can talk about a kind of a
Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask
like,
you to start is, am I wrong to see more of a parallel or more agreement between Greenberg and Debord than I might have thought there was originally? I mean, the thing
there's a
that you
fair
just
amount.
yeah, I mean, Guy Debord he came out of socialism or barbarism, which was an anti-Bolshevik Marxist
It's
socialist journal,
post-Trotskyist, though. Post-Trotskyist.
post-Trotskyist. Yeah,
Yeah, they were Trotskyists.
right. They were, and they broke with Trotskyism and continued Trotskyism is how I would think of them. I mean,
I could put it very simply. which is that the Frankfurt School, Clement Greenberg, and the Situationist International, socialism or barbarism as a kind of lineage, are all influenced by Trotsky in a very profound way. And that is a defense of modernism against the accusations of socialist realism that it was merely bourgeois decadence and individualism and formalism and all that stuff. So why it traces back to Trotsky is Trotsky's Literature and Revolution, written in 1923, and then his later writings in the 30s are really foundational for helping the younger generation of Marxists, Frankfurt School, Greenberg, and others like Historiatis. They understand that the kind of modernist culture that attached itself to the October Revolution. And also, so Benjamin also has a criticism of like futurism, all the isms, constructivism, futurism. Sometimes they supported fascism and sometimes they supported communism, right? Depending on the circumstances. And so Trotsky is foundational for criticizing the claims of those kind of modernist movements to be either a proletarian or a socialist culture. Right. So the basic point, the basic Marxist point, is that there isn't going to be a proletarian culture. It's always going to be bourgeois culture until it's transcended and then becomes true human culture. So there isn't going to be either a socialist or a communist culture either, unless we just make those equivalent to a true human culture, a post-class society culture. So it's tied to the idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat is still under bourgeois conditions and is still capitalist in that sense, still bears all the contradictions of capitalism in it. And so therefore, you're not going to get like a different culture, like proletarian culture, because there is no proletarian culture within capitalism. Unlike bourgeois culture that developed within feudalism. There isn't either a proletarian, let alone a socialist or a communist culture within capitalism. There's only bourgeois culture. When the proletariat is cultured, it's bourgeois, right? All culture is bourgeois in this era. And also, though, because of capitalism, all bourgeois culture in this era is self-contradictory.
Well, I'm going to let myself get distracted by this claim, not because I disagree with it, but because I want to. Because I can imagine the audience disagreeing with what you just said a little bit.
The left is Stalinist this way. The left wants to believe that there is such a thing as working class culture, proletarian culture, socialist and communist culture. Now, there is not, right?
Just the other day, like yesterday, I reposted a conversation that I had with Mark Fisher back in 2014. It was after he had published his essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle.
Right.
And for him, he was talking about the working class and the need for the left to be accommodating to the working class, consider the working class perspective. And he was talking about it as he was valorizing the working class and pointing to the working class as a social class, as a cultural class, as like
as a sociological group,
right? Who had their own ways of talking and their own aesthetics and their own mores and their own ethics and I mean he wasn't that specific, but it was clear to me as we went along that he was not talking about the working class either as a political force or as a group that was relating to the means of production, which would be the
right.
way,
so
right?
The danger here, and this is where the Stalinism comes in, by the way, is that it's not that there isn't cultural heterogeneity in capitalism. There is. Capitalism, and we could say bourgeois culture more generally, appropriates all the pre-existing culture. So, for instance, the danger there when you get into like working class culture versus ruling class culture is that you're going to quickly slide into nationalism. Right? And that's the Stalinism right there. Right? So the true working class culture is going to look like the national culture from which the ruling class has become alienated.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with this for a moment longer before we dive back into art. I'm going to have Catherine Liu on fairly soon.
Mm-hmm.
She's someone who puts forward this argument about the significance of the PMC, the
Yes.
professional middle class, as a force that's
Managerial.
a professional managerial class.
Michael Albert's bosses or coordinator class.
Right.
Of which we are members.
I guess so. Yeah.
We're honorary members.
Right.
People are watching us on YouTube.
Yeah, if you're a YouTuber, you're part of the coordinator class all of a sudden.
No. If you're watching us, we're coordinating the audience, right?
Oh, that's right.
We're exercising our malign influence as intellectuals. We're coordinating, right?
Yeah, but what I noticed about Catherine Liu is that two things. One is that she claims she puts the PMC into the category of being neoliberals.
Sure.
And juxtaposes their policies and their perspectives and their class interests as against redistributist,
right,
working class politics, right?
Well, I mean, look, I'm just going to invoke Lenin here and also Adorno, because why not? Which is the working class is produced by capitalism, meaning it's just as mutilated, just as deformed, bears the marks of oppression like anyone else, right? So oppression oppresses, and it mutilates people. And, you know, we're going to try to achieve socialism with the mutilated subjects of capitalism. We're not going to look for like the good people who somehow embody the true spirit of socialism, because they don't exist. Right. So, I mean, of course, the working class is pretty innocent of a lot of ideology, simply because they're not indoctrinated or initiated. So, you know, we can say that, like, among the subaltern people, there's some spontaneously produced bourgeois culture, you know, a kind of cooperation, you know, spirit of egalitarianism, social justice. There is that. However, there's also, you know, because they're proletarianized, there's also a Darwinian struggle for existence in proletarianization, right? There's also like a ruthless survival instinct, and even, you know, that can translate into communitarian violence and genocidal, you know, fantasies. You know, I mean, in other words, if you ask like a working class person, what's the problem with the world? Why is there poverty? They'll probably tell you something like, there are too many people.
Yeah.
Or that sentiment?
They'll say there are too many lazy people.
Well, that's the same thing, though. In other words, there are too many people, and so who are the people who are too many, right? They're the ones who are not contributing, who are not, you know, who are kind of dead weight. So it's very bourgeois. It's extremely bourgeois, and it cuts both ways, meaning it's bourgeois in a good way, and it's bourgeois in a bad way.
Yeah. So, okay. So just to put a cap on this discussion of the PMC idea, my trouble with it is what's appealing about it is that you can see that the Democratic Party and the leadership there has a set of values which are not aligned with socialism or the working class interests, or certainly not aligned with overcoming the current conditions of society and things like that. And they're really off-putting. I mean, like Hillary Clinton to me is really off-putting. You know,
she certainly is.
Yeah,
she certainly is. You know, they all are more or less, but of course,
Elizabeth Warren also became really off-putting to me. Maybe this is my sexism, but I don't think so.
Right, that was the accusation, right?
Right.
If you don't like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, you must be a sexist or racist, right? But Bernie also throws in with some of this stuff. In other words,
he's become off-putting too. Frankly, we don't like to admit it, but I mean, a lot of what he's done, the way he got in line and allowed this all to happen and pretended like nothing was wrong.
And he believes it, by the way, because, you know, the New Left generated a new ideology for the PMC. It created a new ideology for intellectuals, for intellectual culture, and therefore for a kind of educated professional middle class, but also for the ruling class, right? The rich kids went to the colleges too, right? And they got indoctrinated in this stuff too. I mean, I guess some of them go to Oral Roberts University or something, but not really. No. Right? So, I mean, there is this role that intellectuals play. There is.
Mm-hmm.
And it is more or less nefarious. I mean, really, what it boils down to, I was just doing a kind of very short kind of introduction to Marxism for some of my students, some of my academic students. And we were talking about capitalism from below, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is really the rub, right? This is the point about bourgeois culture and the working class, is that capitalism is generated from below. It's reproduced from below. That's not to say that certain things aren't imposed from above. Of course, a lot of things are imposed from above, but the basic conditions under which everything happens is generated and constantly regenerated, reproduced from below.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if all the billionaires got together...
You're a victim blamer. Go ahead.
If all the billionaires got together tomorrow, if the investor class, the 1%, whatever, got together tomorrow and agreed, you know what, we should be doing communism, not capitalism.
Right.
It couldn't happen. They couldn't make it happen. They could not, because they can't really deal with, they can only change the management of capitalism, the policies. They can't really root out capitalism. Right. Similarly, using Michael Albert's rubric, that we're not just against the 1%, we're against the 20%, against the 80%, the 20%. So let's say all the intellectuals, all the middle management, everyone who's trained and professionalized, let's say that they all got together and said, we should have communism and not capitalism. That's also not going to be sufficient to overcome capitalism. Right. So the issue of saying, look, the working class is bourgeois. It's bourgeois in its culture. It's bourgeois in its existence, and participates directly in the production and reproduction of bourgeois social relations, however, under conditions of industrial production, which means reproducing the contradiction therein in capitalism. They're the ones who are going to have to face this problem, because if the 1% or the 20% face this problem, they're only going to change how capitalism is managed. They're not going to be able to change what it really is as a social relation, as a way of life, way of being, all those things. And there's no guarantee that the working class will be able to do it, right? But the proposition...
There's no guarantee, but if anyone could...
If anyone could...
Right? It would be them, yeah.
And then it becomes, well, who's the working class, right? And then we get into that kind of stuff. And are the PMC workers and blah, 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 right? Aren't they proletarianized? Sure, but the ruling class is also proletarianized, meaning everyone's disposable now. Everyone is ruthlessly disposable. Everyone is existing in bourgeois culture in crisis and in contradiction. But in terms of practical agency and putting the issue of overcoming capitalism on the table, the speculative proposition of Marxism is that only the workers can do it.
Okay, so now let's go back to art, because that's what we're supposed to be talking about. We could talk about this. But
it bears.
Yeah, it's there. Yeah, and we'll come back to it, and it does bear. It has some bearing on how we're going to talk about art. But in my video, one of the things I tried to land on was what Debord's conception of art was, like what it was meant to be, how it failed to arrive, is sort of how I would put it, because art had been a way of confirming the hierarchical structures that were running society through the church, let's say. That's
so the problem with these French people, too Catholic.
Yeah.
And I know of what I speak because I'm Italian American and Irish American. But really, so that thesis of Debord, that the spectacle has its origins, or we could also say maybe he's saying that it recurs in capitalism, but it has its origins in the Counter-Reformation and in the Baroque. It all depends on what we think the Counter-Reformation is. So I guess the idea is that the Protestant Reformation is iconoclastic and has some kind of austerity and is not very arty or something. And whereas the Baroque tries to maintain the church through spectacle And capitalism has come all the way around to trying to maintain itself through the spectacle, the same way the church, under attack from bourgeois society, that's what the Protestant Reformation
Mm-hmm.
is doing something similar. So either the spectacle continues from the Baroque to the present, or it recurs. It seems like Debord's thesis is that it recurs, that there is a kind of a moment of actual bourgeois culture, and also there's a moment of authentic modernism, even in
Mm-hmm.
capitalism, but that it has been subsumed back into this kind of counter-revolutionary spectacle, like the Counter-Reformation, like the Baroque. And
Mm-hmm.
that is an interesting thesis, the flaw of which, for me, is the historical periodization. And it does get to exactly what you said, which is what art is, what it aimed to be, and how it failed to accomplish that.
Mm-hmm.
Because art is really a bourgeois thing, meaning, yes, art is there for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, of course. But art, just art, like not either the propaganda of the church in any civilization, the propaganda of the religion, or the entertainment of the aristocracy, the court culture, or the folk culture of the people.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things are embedded in what Benjamin calls ritual cult value,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to exhibition value. So I want to say something about the way you address Benjamin. Usually people say the main thing with Benjamin is the aura. It is
Mm-hmm.
not. The main thing is the contradiction between cult value and exhibition value.
Okay.
And the aura is a phenomenon of the crisis of exhibition value. So exhibition value is when we look at art as art, where we're not immersed in a religious ritual or some other cultural, social practice, where the art is just the aesthetic aspect of that ritual or that practice. But when we're looking at art per se, that's bourgeois.
Mm-hmm.
When it becomes freed of its cult value and attains exhibition value, when we're regarding the aesthetic experience as its own thing. And that
Mm-hmm.
begins in the Renaissance. And it has its, of course, like a lot of bourgeois things, it has its roots in classical antiquity, meaning you could say that there are moments of ancient Greece and ancient Rome in which art frees itself from ritual cult value and attains exhibition value, also in other classical civilizations, whether, Arabic, Indian, Chinese, African. There are these moments of classical civilization where art does differentiate itself from religion, broadly understood, or from culture, broadly understood, right?
Okay.
So there's that, and then the question is, well, okay, being very Hegelian about it, or very Kantian, like Friedrich Schiller. Well, what is the point of art? What's the aim of art? To express our freedom and
Right.
to be enlightening about our condition and about our struggle for freedom within our real conditions, right?
Right.
That's the aim of art. And then why does it fail under capitalism? Well, that's pretty easy to answer. Because of alienation, contradiction, reification, for all the reasons that all the values of bourgeois society fail in capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have a couple of thoughts about what you just said. Let's see if I can express them. The first thing first of all, I'm understanding now why you want to bring up the difference between bourgeois culture and capitalism. This is
Yes.
important because the perspective that the board takes and that I took is that there is no distinction there. That capitalism is in the bourgeois, okay, from the beginning somehow, right? I think
Right.
that's in the background of this.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll put that question aside for a moment, though.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Let's just cash
so
out the implications.
yeah, I mean, so let's just say that if that's true, then the difference between the kind of art that's embedded in a communal way of life, or or religion, or tradition. These are the ways
Culture,
that,
just culture
yeah.
in general. Mm-hmm.
Well, the board wants to call culture something else. Like he wants to say that culture is like art as art. It's not. Culture is that what we create as free people to sustain us, rather than a traditional way of life that it seems to be coming from
Okay,
the
that's
outside.
fair. I think
Yeah,
that's because another preoccupation of his is hierarchy.
right.
right? And that's where again Greenberg has a bad reputation, and the Frankfurt School also, because they're seen as elitist, right, and
Mhm.
only interested in high art. Well, that's actually not true. They're actually very interested in so-called low art, because popular culture is also art. It is
Mhm.
art. In other words,
Mhm.
when looked at not as culture, but as aesthetic objectification, of course it's all art. It's not like only some things are art. Again, when you regard it in its exhibition value as opposed to its cult value. Now, so-called high art can also be just culture. It can be the culture of the elite, in which case it also has its own ritual value, cult value, at the expense of its exhibition value. It
Mhm.
loses that ability to make us critically aware of aesthetic form and our subjectivity and all those things, and it just becomes high class trash as opposed to low class trash, which is, by the way, kitsch.
Mhm.
There's high class kitsch too.
Oh yeah.
It's not like kitsch is
Nowadays,
only
they're
for
very
the.
difficult to tell the difference between the high class and the low class kitchen aesthetic terms. I mean, look at Jeff Koons for crying out loud. But
It's all kind of kitsch though at this point, meaning high art, the way capitalism treats the high art of the past, it's kitschified.
yeah, okay. So let's. That's kind of a value judgment, an aesthetic judgment that are not quite in this
It's
conversation
not a value judgment.
arriving.
It's about its function. In other words,
Right,
kitsch.
but we have to figure out the function first
Yeah, go
before we
ahead.
can.
Uh
Okay,
huh.
so all right, um, so the argument that the board is making is that in a society which is actually determined by capital relations and commodification,
Mm
um, the aim of art cannot be reached except in so much as it exposes
hmm. Mm hmm.
its own, let's say, ineptitude, its own. Um, uh, uh, the word's not. I'm thinking I have a Freudian block here. I guess,
Incompetence
yeah.
or
Impotence.
inadequacy?
Impotence is the word that I'm blocking out.
Impotence. Uh huh.
So,
Mm hmm.
its own impotence, and so it can't arrive at itself. It can't take responsibility for creating and exhibiting its own freedom
Mm hmm. Mm hmm.
because it is. Because the truth of society is that there is this value which is operative outside through our social relations, but which is alienated from us,
Yep.
right? So now the question of exhibition is that when you think of exhibition, one way you exhibit work is at Christie's, right?
Mm,
Yeah, one of the ways that one of the values that still remains for art is this commodified or monetary value that can be attached.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this is
NFTs.
NFTs are like the ultimate example of that because clearly no one is buying a bored ape for its aesthetic or cultural
So let
significance.
me let me say something about this, because again, I would distinguish between capital and bourgeois social relations,
Hmm.
in that capital and value as a function of capital is a self-contradiction of the bourgeois social relation. It's a
Right,
self-contradiction of commodity production,
right.
meaning there would be no, Pache Debord and also other leftists, there would be no contradiction necessarily between a work of art's commodity character and its exhibition value. There
Mhm.
would not. In other words, obviously that's how art is made starting in the Renaissance. It's made as a commodity. And that does not prevent it from being humanistic and expressing the task of freedom and even the realization of freedom, if only at the level of the self recognition of subjectivity. It doesn't prevent that at all. Indeed, commodification facilitates that.
Mhm.
Right. So, what you're talking about now, about like Christie's, so this is in the capitalist era.
Mhm.
And of course, you could say perhaps before, but really in the industrial capitalist era, works of art are acquired not for their kind of intrinsic value, like use value,
Mhm.
their aesthetic value, but as investment items. In other words, the art market becomes something that needs to be propped up, and rich people invest in art because it's a safe investment, because it's going to hold value better than stocks in a company,
Mhm.
right? And obviously NFTs, that's what we're talking about, right?
Right.
Right? And so when it becomes capital, then it becomes in contradiction with its commodity character, because actually then you're not really talking about the exchange value of something. You're talking about something as a place where the value of capital attempts to be
It's a
stored.
stand in for money, but money is
Right.
also a commodity, and commodities value changes in relationship to the rest of the commodities. And so you're
Yep.
looking for
Yep.
a commodity that's stable.
Well, because capitalism is a crisis of money. I mean, obviously, most people think that capitalism is money. It's money relations. It isn't. It's a crisis of money as
yeah,
a commodity, actually.
right. Yeah. So what I want to get to is, okay, so the freedom going back to just bourgeois freedom, the freedom that bourgeois culture offers up to humanity is a freedom to change the terms of their social relationships that will sustain them. That is the freedom that we're being offered. It's to change who we are as individuals, to think of for ourselves, like this Kantian kind of freedom. But it's
Yep.
also this Hegelian part, which is like
Hmm.
we are also collective. We're also
Collectively. Hmm.
being dictated to by an objective world,
Yep.
which we then, but we still have which we have the power to change. So,
Manifesting at a concrete level. In
right.
other words, insofar as we're still living in bourgeois society, in bourgeois social relations, and therefore in bourgeois freedom, of course we're free to individually and collectively affect things at a concrete level. It's at
Mhm.
a more abstract level that we're dominated by the contradiction of industrial production with those bourgeois social relations. It's at a more
Right.
abstract level that capital constrains us. And so, of course, we regard, and we manifest our struggle for freedom at a concrete level, not at an abstract level. And we are still free to change those things a great deal.
Right. But it becomes difficult to think of that freedom in aesthetic, visual terms or musical terms,
Hmm.
because the foundation for aesthetic seems to be we want it to be objective. I think. I
It's
think we
inevitably subjective, though, isn't it?
right. It is, but
But it's not an object, right? So it's the
I
subject
mean, like,
object dialectic.
right. And but also we want it to be embodied and uh you know
Sensual.
sensual,
Hmm.
exactly.
Hmm.
Um and so this freedom seems to be at this moment entirely kind of empty and abstract. It doesn't have, like, what I've noticed is like both
Sure.
Board and like Arthur Danto, who is a
Yeah.
Warholian art critic, which I
Uh-huh.
mentioned in the video, both arrived to this point where they said art is dead, art is no longer useful, art can't get us there.
Uh-huh.
Um, but for Danto, he said, art is dead, and but can still be enjoyed because what's sustaining art is theory. What's sustaining art is the institutions
Well,
of cultural
so let me
interpretation.
say this about
And
okay,
let
go
me
ahead.
get to the end. And De
Yeah.
Board, on the other hand, said, no, theory
Right.
isn't sustaining art. Theory is where giving us the power to see how art is dead, and then negate art, and also negate. What does he say? So we got to both negate art and then also to realize it. This is
Yeah,
the
that was an
separation.
interesting point that you raised, which is Dada and surrealism,
Hmm.
or I suppose he's kind of saying the avant-garde versus modernism, maybe.
Well, they're both avant-garde, Dadaism
They
and
are both
Surrealism.
avant-garde, but I thought actually the Dada surrealism, that Dada aims to negate art and surrealism aims to realize it. I thought actually maybe it's the avant-garde seeks to negate art and modernism seeks to realize it. And you can't really separate those. In other words, it's hard to say, like any
It's
movement
like
embodies both.
there can be a left within capital.
Mm-hmm.
There can be a right within the avant-garde, and
Sure.
surrealism. So surrealism is realizing art without negation, without negating it, is what. So in other words, it remained
Depending
in
on
the
how you see it.
realm. Yeah, it remained within the realm of art production within capitalism.
I mean, Bataillean surrealism would be, I guess, what people think of as the left wing of surrealism, as opposed to Breton, who's the right wing of surrealism. There's a problem here, though, which is
Mhm.
that it isn't really a left right thing in art,
Mhm.
but it is a matter of a contradiction and as a kind of an engine. In other
Mhm.
words, you could say that art in the era of capitalism, because again, we shouldn't just take the 20th century avant gardes as our models, we also have
Mhm.
to reach back into the 19th century.
Yeah,
That
like realism and impressionism.
Yep. Exactly. And that all of these modernist phenomena, because there's a reason why the Marxists didn't distinguish between modernism and the avant-garde, actually. It's only later, it's really with postmodernism that you get this distinction, and Debord is bound up in that. That there's a contradiction, that art is always negating itself by realizing itself, and realizing itself by negating itself. But from a Frankfurt School perspective, and also from Clement Greenberg's perspective, he's actually influenced by the Frankfurt School. That it's always cut short. In other words, that all these movements have this impulse towards negating and realizing, towards transcending, but they're all cut short. They all are fragmentary in the sense that they're not realized, they're not fully realized. And so what you have is what Benjamin called, in the era of capitalism, everything produced by bourgeois society is immediately a ruin. Right? And that's, like, it's clear that there's something pathological going on in the capitalist era. It's how we grasp that pathology, right? So, because socialist realism, which is hanging in the background, Stalinism, we have to, give it its due. In other words, why were people socialist realists? They basically want socialism to recover bourgeois realism. Right? So they basically say, well, the bourgeoisie, when they were progressive, produced a good culture, but then circa 1848, they became reactionary, and then they started producing this bad culture, modernism, kind of kitsch, kind of foisting things onto the working class. Who, we haven't mentioned? T.J. Clark.
Yeah.
T.J. Clark, right? And basically, is a situationist and is a kind of a post-Marxist. Not really a Marxist, though. Like, less of a Marxist than Debord.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, right? far less. But, he survived. I mean, that's why. Right?
But, T.J. Clark, who I teach academically, whose work I teach his books on 1848, and I teach his books on the Second Empire. And I also teach some of his later stuff. I think it gets progressively worse the further he gets away from 1848, because he tends to be dismissive of 20th century modernism. And he holds on to this kind of unrealized moment, circa 1848, of like a true democratization of culture, right, that gets channeled into modernism instead, and, kind of miserably ever after. But really the issue is, how do we understand that change? Like, why did bourgeois culture go into crisis? Was it just, the bourgeoisie decided it was against the working class, and then it had to engage in this counter-revolutionary Baroque kind of modernism, trickling all the way down to its kitschy versions,
right?
Class. But then where does that leave you exactly? Like, what are the resources then? Whereas the Frankfurt School and Greenberg does find a contradiction in capitalist culture and capitalist art, which is the basis for indicating the possibility of change. Right? So it's not like modernism is just individualistic and formalistic and antisocial and bourgeois decadent, but it's actually expressing a possibility beyond bourgeois society, beyond capitalism. That's why it appears to be so, like, anti-humanistic, right? Like, all the charges that socialist realism made against modernism, that it's anti-humanist. Well, maybe it is, right? But what do we make of that? Do we make of that just a kind of narcissistic bourgeois decadence and antisocial? Or do we see it as, in whatever deformed way, constrained and deformed way, suggesting possibilities beyond capitalism? Right? So modernism still needs to be redeemed in that respect. It can't be taken as a model for a better culture, but it can be taken as an authentic symptom, as opposed to something that we ignore because it's just these isolated artists and who cares. Right?
Yeah, okay. I mean, like, I just go back to Debord. Debord's answer to how to realize art and negate it is workers' councils. That,
Good luck with that.
I mean, I know maybe that's not the right strategy, but the point is that his realization of art and negation of art was social political revolution. And
Oh,
he
well,
thought,
certainly.
okay, and he thought workers' councils were what could
Oh, yeah,
achieve that.
certainly. It's just that at a cultural, again, this is where Trotsky comes in.
Right.
And it's really where the old style Marxism comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what we were talking about earlier about the PMC and intellectuals,
Mm-hmm.
which is, the dreaded merger formula of the Leninist Party,
Mm-hmm.
Kautsky's merger formula of, the fusion of the workers' movement with the socialist intelligentsia in the party, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but when workers become party cadre, and of course this is Debord's mania, right?
Mm-hmm.
He knows when workers become cadre, they become bourgeois intellectuals,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not a sociological or class problem. It's an ideological problem. And art is ideology. Art is bourgeois ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even when a worker becomes an artist or an intellectual, a theorist, or a party militant cadre, they become bourgeois intellectuals, and they become therefore sites of this ideological contradiction,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, even if they remain sociologically workers, in other words, let's say they're still doing their wage labor, but in their free time they're cadre, right? Of course,
Mm-hmm.
they've still become bourgeois intellectuals, and therefore, so an artist, it doesn't matter whether they come from a wealthy class, a middle class, or the working class. Once they become artists, once they start making art, they're doing so as bourgeois intellectuals. Artists
Mm-hmm.
are intellectuals. They're engaged in intellectual labor, and they are engaged in a practice of bourgeois ideology, namely art. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, this is where Debord's pathos is, because he knows art is bourgeois ideology. The question is, in what way, and what do we make of that? Right? This is where the immanent critique is so important, where it's not like, because this is where T.J. Clark kind of goes, right? So art is bourgeois ideology, and therefore we just want to abolish it.
Mm-hmm.
No, we also want to.
Well, no, we want to realize it,
right,
and abolish it. But
right.
Okay, so like I agreed with everything you said, but I think the board's answer would be okay. An actual revolution would overcome commodification and the spectacle.
In the long run, sure.
Well, that's where there's differences of opinion. How long a run is it? How much of a transition do we need?
A generation.
How much? Well, like the board might not think that. I mean, look, I come out of the Marxist Humanist Initiative, and Kleinman said specifically, there is no transitionary period between capitalism.
Yeah, they just lose their minds over this. The point of the matter is,
but he said there's a political transition. There's a political transition,
right?
But at the level of production and economy, the revolution either starts to either happens in in a Hegelian way. Is either you transform the basis of society or you don't. Then once you transform the basis of society, then after that there'll be political transitions. There'll be cultural transitions.
Okay.
That will all lag behind the real foundation of the change.
Well, sure. I mean, no doubt. I mean, so, we have to think about what's the hang-up.
So the way I thought of that is like at the level of the factory, at the level of production, there will be immediate changes in how we produce and how we distribute.
This is to Rick Wolf.
Well, it is, isn't it? Which is why you end up being attracted to people like Michael Albert and Richard Wolff as you try to figure out what the. But then my way of figuring it out. Well, no, if you're a climate, if you're climate,
or
okay,
whatever, it's a problem because look, why did Lenin and Trotsky say that the dictatorship of the proletariat will have one-man management?
Well, because because it doesn't. I'm not sure why they said. I can tell you why that doesn't bother me in the slightest.
Okay, it doesn't bother me either.
Yeah, the reason why it wouldn't bother me is because what are they managing is the key.
That's
not
who is
managing it or how that management is structured. Like if you're thinking of, this is where I get kind of arty farty. If you're thinking of production as something that's realizing art, then the production of the material goods for society, might be run like a symphony orchestra, rather than where the production itself
Mm-hmm.
is what is providing people with the motivation to work and to
Oh,
be there.
sure. Oh, no
Rather,
doubt. Right.
the enjoyment of the actual production process,
By the way,
the aesthetic of it.
that goes on now already. In other words, people
I
show
know
up to work.
gamification is happening now. All sorts
People,
of
no, but people show up to work at the most like miserable, alienated, whatever job, out of a sense of solidarity with their coworkers, out of a sense of duty and cooperation, out of a
yeah,
sense.
but I'm talking about work where the beauty
Mm,
of production and
mm,
the enjoyment, like if you go and play in a symphony orchestra or a quartet,
mm-hmm.
you're not going there out of the sense of solidarity necessarily. You're going there because the pleasure you take and the enjoyment you get from doing the actual thing, the playing, is what it gives it value. So I'm saying you go to work because the
It's a
work itself.
grind. It's a grind. They have to practice.
I know.
Most of the labor is practice. That's
Yeah,
not
I'm not
necessarily
saying that
right.
there's no self-sacrifice involved in getting that pleasure. I'm just saying it's not because you then. I mean, look, if you're part of a
But
professional
the
orchestra,
product
it's
is
different.
separate from the labor. In other words, the labor might be like a grind, and then the product is what you take pride in.
Right, but the product is it's the actual work.
Is it?
Yeah. When you're in, I mean, at least a good part of it is like, like
This might be. I feel like suddenly I'm flashing on like the physical labor of making like plastic art, meaning painting and sculpture.
mhm, mhm,
And it's physically grueling. It costs people their health and their lives. It
mhm,
does. Dangerous material, oil paint. It's dangerous.
mhm,
And certainly modern sculptural materials are dangerous, but also older sculptural materials are dangerous. And the commodity, it's not. It is separate from the labor, meaning the labor is the process and the commodity is the object, right? So again, the idea that what we're going to do is sort of dissolve all objects because we're against commodification. I mean, this is the Debordism. It's a problem, right?
mhm. Well,
So
I'm not trying to dissolve all objects. I'm trying to dissolve what mediates the object, which is the abstract labor time
sure, sure, yeah,
that
yeah, yeah. That's
embodied in not
capital, though,
right,
as
it's
opposed to the
capital, right? I'm
commodity.
trying to dissolve that relation. So I'm saying we
And
can
that can only
imagine.
happen societally. That can't happen at a micrological level.
True, I agree.
Can't happen at
So
the point of production.
if it can, it has to happen at the point of production, or else it hasn't happened.
No, it will
It
happen
just
at the
hasn't
point of
happened at all the points of production,
yeah, it
or at
has to
least the
happen
majority of the points of production.
societally in
Otherwise,
such
there's
a
no
way.
relation between them. You can't tackle the distribution if it just at one in one factory. You can't say, "Oh, we're
Right,
going to produce for some other reason than
right,
exchange."
right,
So you have to have a
right.
workers' movement where
I
they
mean,
take
the
over.
reason that Lenin and Trotsky were not against one man management is
Mm,
because they were for the unionization of the workers, meaning they were for continuing the confrontation of workers and management,
mhm,
right? As a site of working through this overcoming of, right? So, in
mm,
other words, it's going to be mediated at many levels. So, the idea is that you unionize all workers,
mm,
even professionals, right? And this, of
mm,
course, happens in capitalism as well,
mhm,
right? Um, and there is going to be a contradiction between the dictates of the manager and the dictates of the workers. And the manager is going to represent capital. And what that means is society as a whole,
mhm,
right? In other
mhm,
words, the reason that they're not anarcho syndicalists is that, and we've talked about this, I think, many, many years ago now, probably,
mhm.
is that um, the means of production belong to society, not only to the workers who are using them.
Right,
Right. And
right,
so the manager and the labor union are both making claims on the means of production as the property of society.
right.
Right. So that's why they had no problem with workers co-management, but they didn't think that you just dissolve management. Right.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
at some point in the future, maybe things will be very different. But in in reality now, like the dictatorship of the proletariat and the lower stage of communism is still going to have this issue of order givers and order takers, the Castoriadis, like socialism or barbarism thing. You can't like get rid of that by fiat. You have to actually transcend it.
I want to ask you about Tom Wolfe because I want to get back to art for a second.
You mean
Tom Wolfe.
Bonfire of the Vanities, or not Bonfire of the Vanities? You mean Radical Chic?
Well, he wrote those things, but he also, I think it's the same guy. Maybe it's a different guy who wrote against Greenberg.
He
About the
might
painted
have
word.
in the
He wrote
'60s.
a book called The Painted Word.
I'm
Um,
not familiar with that. Okay.
yeah, but his charge in The Painted Word was that these highbrow intellectuals had come along and ruined art by thinking that their criticism was more important than the artwork itself. And I mean,
Maybe.
I haven't read. I just read about this book. I haven't read Tom Wolfe's The Painted Word. I should read it.
No, I mean that
Um,
might be again a fair criticism in the sense that sure, right? But is that
I mean
Greenberg's like
that. I mean,
fault?
but that's literally what Debord
Yes.
and Arthur Danto have said, just in different perspectives. Debord
Yes.
says has to be critical theory
Uh-huh.
that replaces the art that negates art and
Mm-hmm.
then realizes it.
Mm-hmm.
And Danto is saying, from a more conservative perspective,
Mm-hmm.
it's critical. It's not critical theory; it's art theory. It's a community of the people who are educated enough and institutionalized enough
Mm-hmm.
to be able to appreciate and
This is the
uh,
Hegelian view, actually. So the Hegelian view is that Romanticism registered a crisis of bourgeois art where the spontaneous inhabiting of the aesthetic experience at both an
mm-hmm,
individual and the collective level could no longer happen,
mm-hmm,
right? So it no longer, the artwork couldn't sort of stand on its own, couldn't be enjoyed by the community
mm-hmm,
just as such, but that actually to appreciate art and to really experience it, in fact, you needed things like art history, art theory, art criticism, art
mm-hmm.
philosophy. You needed that. And, that's an interesting point, right? Because we could say, okay, that registers in some early way crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, again, it's sort of not accidental that this is happening during the Industrial Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
and that the Industrial Revolution is already conditioning things like the French Revolution, if not in France, simply by virtue of the fact that it makes Britain a counter-revolutionary force against the French Revolution,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and everything that follows from that, all the suffering of the French Revolution that that entails. So it's an interesting point. I would say Danto's really recapitulating that Hegelian issue.
Well, he was a Hegelian. I mean,
Yeah, he is a Hegelian,
that's
right?
like, yeah,
And so, it's conservative in a sense, but it's also, Hegel was also somewhat optimistic about our living in a philosophical society, meaning a more abstract society that's more conceptually mediated. And so there was a kind of a sense that everyone is a philosopher, everyone is a critic. In other words, that no one enjoys art without a kind of discourse of art criticism.
right,
And blogs about movies, right? In other
right,
words,
right.
like everybody's a critic, everybody's got an opinion, everyone's got a concept of art against which they're measuring the experience of the object.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, right?
Right.
The issue though there is like, but what about the theory? In other words, the theory, insofar as it's an affirmative theory, that it is a sort of established discourse for how we talk about art, that might be masking a great deal. That might be actually giving us a false sense that we know what's going on in the art,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, whereas a critical theory would register a crisis of theory, also, like, do we know what we are looking at?
Right. Well, I mean, this is the difference between Danto and Debord, I think, is
Right.
that he's saying he is happy to present a circular theory
Uh-huh.
for what art is. It's well, actually, it's Dickey who admits this. George Dickey later on says, this is a circle. I say, well, what is art? Art is what an educated audience can appreciate, and what can they appreciate? Well, art. So it's
Tautological.
yeah, yeah.
The problem there is that lends itself to another French problem, which is power knowledge discourse. Right, Foucault. In other words, art is what it is by virtue of institutionalization, and then you get the postmodernist attack on the museum, right? And on the institutions of art, you get a kind of neo-avant-gardism, where Duchamp's urinal is an attack on the institution of art.
Right.
Right.
Well, what art? So back
which
to
I think
the
is
board.
kind of flat, by the way.
Right. But what the board would say is, look, art today, when properly understood, is a spectacle, is holding us into position of audience, holding us in the position of passive viewer. But when we realize art, we first have to negate that, and then we are challenged to come up with a critical theory that can transform the
This
world.
Is romanticism. This is a romantic kind of
You think
recoil.
so?
Yeah, it's a recoil against classicism and the Baroque in that respect. I mean, I think that the problem I've always had with Debord is that at a descriptive level, it's actually quite interesting and compelling and can be accurate. But the issue is, how is the spectacle dialectical? How does the spectacle point beyond itself? Like, in other words, maybe we need to realize the spectacle and not just abolish it.
Well, I agree. That is
Right?
That's what. Do you read my book? I sent you this book. Did you ever?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
Because that's
sure,
what I'm trying to do.
Yes.
Is realize the spectacle and think through what it would be like to realize the spectacle.
Well, at the level of, I mean, and again, the spectacle is funny because it's kind of like, I think for Debord, it's both abstract and concrete.
Yeah.
And so when you make like the spectacle into virtual reality, that might be a little bit too concrete.
Well, my point is that in that realm, one thing that is not happening is commodity production and exchange based on labor time.
How so? How is it not?
Because instead, what's happening is that people are acting out their desires as mediated through augmented reality, and the computer is just sort of managing, like it's a planned economy fully.
They're still spending their time though.
They are spending their time, but spending your time is not the same thing as commodity production. You have to spend time, but then what sets up an exchange of one thing for another is not the amount of time spent.
Here's where we need freedom.
Right.
Meaning, yes, we're going to spend our time beyond capitalism.
Yeah. And we're even going to spend it productively. We're even going to produce things but what creates the value in that thing is not how much time we spent on it.
The question is, how are we going to realize our freedom in that expenditure of time? That's
right. Right. Yeah.
And freedom in the sense of transformation, not just in the sense of, I'm off the clock, right? In other words, we shouldn't think of socialism as abolishing labor time and, just having leisure time forever, right?
Right.
Because, of course, it will abolish the distinction between labor time and leisure time, which does not mean returning to an immediacy of, being a priest and being a nobleman and being a peasant 24/7, or being a blacksmith or an artist.
Yeah. No, this is something that so this is something I had written down. I didn't ask any of the questions hardly that I had planned, but this is something I had written down, was that the romanticism there. Mm-hmm. I do think there's a streak of romanticism in Debord as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's why I think someone like Ken Knob, who's like an American interpreter and translator, is also like a Buddhist.
Sure.
And, and
it follows.
Right. And why some of the other American situationists ended up in Hindi cults and, and things like that. Mm-hmm. Overall, there's this desire to find a justification for society that would be that we imagine, because we weren't there. We just sort of retrospectively or nostalgically imagine that
Mm-hmm.
in the time of the dominance of the Catholic Church, people knew what they were supposed to be doing, and they didn't have this hollow feeling that bourgeois freedom has given them, right?
Well, the question is, what's the content of that hollow feeling? In other words, the content of
Right.
the hollowed feeling is the frustrated revolution. In other words, of course, we all want to be revolutionaries in this society. This is a revolutionary society. We
Right.
don't want to be peasants or noblemen or priests, right? Or guild craftsmen communing with the mysteries of the materials, right?
Mm-hmm.
And which
Right.
artists can fall into that craft guild kind of
Mm-hmm.
production kind of mentality. We are revolutionaries. Everyone is a revolutionary in this society. That's what it means to say that all humans are free qua human, which is what Hegel said.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's true. That was not true in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the only revolutionaries were religious prophets.
Right. Right.
Luther,
Right.
that's the only revolutionary that could exist. Or I guess, if a nobleman or a king got jacked up on some, had a revelation, then they could, lead some schism or something.
So I think today there are some revolutionaries that appear like religious prophets, and you can, and usually they're the ones
They
like,
all do. Marx does. Come on.
but yeah, Bertrand certainly did,
Well, he didn't
Debord.
intend to, though. I have a soft spot for Breton. I
I
know that
like him.
Breton. Yeah, I know that Breton gets like the postmodernist. He gets the hind leg kick from postmodernism, and they only like Bataille. Breton is good, but again, he knew. Okay, so he knew the difference between being an artist and being a political revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, in the sense of being everyone's a revolutionary in this society, we're talking about at the level of society and culture. And again, we're talking about transformation at a concrete level, like how we actually live our lives, how we do things. This is a revolutionary society, however, constrained and distorted by the domination of capital, which
Mm-hmm.
simply means by the contradiction of industrial production and bourgeois social relations.
Right.
Right? And so that hollow feeling comes from a sense of we've wasted our lives. How
Mm-hmm.
have we wasted our lives, right? Because the struggle for freedom is stalled.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it does seem forbidden to us. Like it seems inaccessible, like we can't participate in it. Like instead we live under this dead weight. And certainly Debord comes out of this,
Mm-hmm.
of failed revolution and feeling the futility of it all.
Right. But he tried to answer that by
Mm-hmm.
creating the Situationist International. And it didn't succeed. It had its moment of glory, maybe not,
It
maybe
made some
only as propaganda.
gestures. It
Yeah.
made some gestures. Habermas, by the
But he
way.
would point to May 68 in Paris
Yeah,
as,
yeah. Here's Habermas. Okay, so
yeah.
Habermas generally is problematical, but he gave a great speech when he received the Adorno Prize
Mm-hmm.
on on the issue of postmodernism. Modernity and incomplete project.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, he said, well, the best that art can do is engage in surrealist revolts. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what the Situationist International did. Or that's the frame it put around May 68. They transformed it into a surrealist revolt.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, of course, it was not meant to be a surrealist revolt. It was a student and worker uprising,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like they were not, aiming at some kind of aesthetic,
But
cultural.
yeah, but they weren't aiming at being a surrealist revolutionary group either. They wanted to transcend surrealism, and they wanted
But they
to
can't.
negate art and realize it. But
They
that's what the
can't.
Situationist was aiming at. And they did have an influence on the workers in Nanterre like a year before 68. They were part of a scandal there. They had written a pamphlet called On the Poverty of Student Life.
Uh-huh.
And those students were instrumental in creating the unrest that then moved from there to the
Oh,
Sorbonne. And
sure. I mean, look, artists can play a role. It's not to say
right.
that artists can't play a role,
Yeah.
but you know, then we're going to be with Benjamin's author as producer. Meaning,
Right.
what role do they play? They don't play the role of producing a better culture,
Right.
right?
No, he wanted to help produce a revolution.
No,
And
no, but
he's going
also in culture, in art, Artists
Yeah.
can basically make us critically aware of the experiential crisis that we're in, right?
Well,
In other
let
words,
me read this quote from Greenberg at the end, where he
okay,
quotes
great.
Marx,
Hmm.
and then we'll wrap it up here. He says, "Here, as in every other question today, it becomes necessary to quote Marx word for word. Today, we no longer look towards socialism for a new culture, as inevitably as one will appear once we do have socialism. Today, we look to socialism simply for the preservation of whatever living culture we have right now." So
Whatever
what does he
living
mean?
culture,
Yeah, whatever. What does he mean by living culture there?
critical culture that indicates at least the task of freedom.
Right.
So his categories in that avant-garde and kitsch, something that you touched on earlier. It's. I think that Debord is freaked out by mannerism, by a kind of mannerism. Whether Baroque or post-romantic, right, or a kind of like kitschy style of 20th century culture. Kind of kitschy modernism. So Greenberg says kitsch imitates the avant-garde. So kitsch is the rear guard as opposed to the avant-garde.
Mm-hmm.
The avant-garde imitates the processes of art. And he called both of them expressions of Alexandrianism, which is barbarism, the barbarization of bourgeois culture. In other words, when culture is no longer living, but is something you could find in a library, like the library at Alexandria, or you find in a museum, right? You get a kind of mummified, sort of dead letter, and that art, as soon as it's made, becomes that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so there's two ways that people respond to that. One is to revel in it, that's kitsch, and one is to try desperately to revolt against it, that's the avant-garde. But the avant-garde actually can't do it. Like he says,
Right.
all it does is set Alexandrianism in motion.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, it's very much like capitalism. In other words, capitalism sets society in motion, but in a kind of dead way, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so preserve whatever is living in culture. Well, that might be historical at this point, or it might be that critical moment that you can have with the avant-garde, but that kitsch sort of resigns itself to not doing. Like, in other words, just entertainment, as opposed to this kind of what Adorno calls a kind of terrifying moment that you have with art. You can have it with kitsch, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
if you allow yourself to. Kitsch does everything it can to hide it.
Mm-hmm.
That moment of terror, though, of like, fuck, I actually don't know what world I'm living in. That's what the art,
Yeah.
confronts you with. That's
Yeah.
living, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
funny kind of living in
Yeah.
capitalism.
Listen, I want to hold you on this stream for a little longer because I'm going to do a second half for patrons, but it's going to be shorter, maybe about half an hour.
Okay.
But I want to talk to you about your art